Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, and welcome to our webinar, Principles for Effective Public Engagement on Climate Change, a Handbook for the IPCC. My name is Leanne Deleg, and I'm Head of Communications at Climate Outreach. Climate Outreach, we're a team of social scientists and communication specialists whose focus is to help organizations better engage their audiences with climate change. Because as you may have seen in some of the promo material for this webinar, climate change does not communicate itself. I'm sure everybody on this call can think of examples where climate change has been communicated and seen that it is not only ineffective but actually counterproductive. And so we're based in the UK, but we work worldwide with a range of audiences from international bodies like the IPCC to government, NGOs, business and community groups, often in partnership with academic institutions. A few quick points before I introduce our speakers. There will be a Q&A, and we invite you to type in your questions in the question box, which should be on the right of your screen. You can type in your questions at any moment, or your comments at any moment during the webinar. You don't need to wait until we start the Q&A. And they will be shared with everybody. They will appear, but not your name, so they are anonymous. And we really look forward to seeing your questions and getting to as many as we can in the Q&A section. If you have any technical difficulties, please type your question in the same spot. That won't be shared with everybody, but you can share your questions there if you're having technical issues, and we'll make sure that they get sent to our technician. If you are on Twitter and you'd like to tweet during the webinar and follow the conversation there, we'll be using the hashtag CommsIPCC. We've also got the Twitter handles of Climate Outreach and IPCC there on that slide. And we will email a recording of the webinar within a few days for your reference. So I'd like to introduce our speakers now. So Dr. Adam Corner, he's the research director here at Climate Outreach and an honorary research fellow in the School of Psychology at Cardiff University. And he is the lead author, along with Dr. Chris Shaw, of the handbook that you're about to hear about. And he's also co-authored a book that was published just last year, Talking Climate from Research to Practice in Public Engagement. And so he will be sharing key insight from the handbook for about 25 minutes. But before that, we will have an introduction by Dr. Roz Pidcock. She is the head of communication at IPCC Working Group 1. And she wrote the foreword for the handbook, and she will be introducing the webinar. It's my pleasure to hand over to Roz now. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. That was a wonderful intro. And a big hello and thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar today. It's really been a fantastic response to the handbook. I think we're all just so pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about it a little bit more. So in a couple of minutes, Adam's going to take you through the main insights from the handbook. But I just wanted to say a little bit more about, I guess, where this idea came from, the rationale for doing it, really. And I think it's exactly as the introduction said, climate change does not communicate itself. That's the bottom line that we're starting from here. But it feels like it's never been more important to make sure that the science is heard and understood. The fact that scientific papers are published and IPCC assessments are done just isn't enough. We can work harder to make sure that information reaches the audiences who need that information. So the IPCC held an expert workshop on communications a couple of years ago. And I think underpinning that was the recognition that there's just this wealth of literature on the science of communicating climate change. And some of that research documents the kind of things that make communicating climate change difficult. Some of the stumbling blocks and some of the challenges. Sometimes it can feel distant. It can feel quite intangible, and there are uncertainties that need to be put into the context of what is known. But it's that same social science literature that offers insights about how to deal with some of those challenges, how to overcome some of those challenges, that are personal values, worldviews, social norms, affect how we assimilate information and apply it to our own lives has really been known for decades. And the fact that we, as human beings, we respond to other human faces, we relate to real world examples, and we tend to make sense of the world through storytelling. You know, those are all really well established concepts in the social sciences. So all that information is there for the taking, but sometimes it's difficult to make sense of it, and there's a lot of it. So picking out the principles, the key principles, can be quite overwhelming, can feel quite difficult, especially for a busy scientist. So I think that we wanted, so here in the WG1 TSU, I think we wanted a guide for IPCC scientists that just distilled the most essential principles. So I wanted a resource that has very practical, useful tips, but that is also deeply rooted in the evidence base. You know, IPCC assessments are known the world over for their quality, comprehensiveness, and rigor. And I wanted to take the same approach to communications as we do to science. So using the best available evidence that's out there. It's also often assumed, I think, that IPCC scientists are more restricted than others in talking about what they do. And personally, I think that that could not be further from the truth. You know, there's an incredible diversity of experience, knowledge, and insight within the IPCC team. You know, the IPCC scientists are the leading lights and the up-and-coming stars in their fields. And I think it's exactly those people that we want talking about the science and why it matters. So we wanted to show that there is evidence, there are tried and tested methods and guidance to help them do that. We wanted to produce something that IPCC scientists can feel confident contains the best available evidence and tailored for them. So it can be a personal thing. I think some people will read this handbook, kind of go away, think about it, and pick out the bits that resonate most for you. Or, you know, we can do this together. This was a signal to IPCC scientists as well that we are very much supportive and proactive in terms of communications, and it fits within a wider commitment that's going on within the IPCC at the moment towards communications. And we will be looking at ways to scale up some of the principles that we've covered in the handbook, looking for ways we can continue to support our authors and continue to evolve the resources that we're producing. The IPCC's role is and always will be to provide balanced, robust and policy-neutral summary of the science. But it is vital that we encourage our authors to talk more about their work, to build connections and to explain what we're doing here. You know, we're gearing up within the IPCC for an extremely busy few years, not least of which is the special report on 1.5 degrees that is coming out in October. But as well as that, in 2018, we've got selection of authors for the next main assessment report, a conference on cities and climate change, 2 expert meetings, 5 lead author meetings for the different special reports, and the first lead author meeting for the next assessment report as well. And that's all in addition to the 1.5 report. So it's a really packed schedule that we've got here. And I think it's really important that we as the IPCC forge links with the global climate communications community and start to use some of the best available evidence out there for how we can communicate the work that we're doing. And this handbook is a really, really positive first step, and it's been such a privilege to work with Climate Outreach on this particular product. And it's not a rule book to follow. You know, it's a collection of ways to make public engagement more effective and enjoyable. And whilst it is tailored for IPCC scientists, it really does apply to all climate scientists. And it's really, I love that this is being viewed as such a useful resource in the wider scientific community as well. And I think the key to that, at least what I really liked about it, is its condensed form. It's very, you know, the emphasis on strong, practical information, and it feels very manageable. So we had an internal webinar earlier for IPCC scientists, but I know there are a lot of climate scientists on this call, and it'd be really great, as well as hearing us talk today, or mainly Adam, I'll stop talking in a second. It would be really great to hear from you about what you think. You know, we're really keen to hear how you think you'll be using this resource. And just before I hand over to Adam, I'd really just like to thank the people who have been involved in reviewing the handbook. and offering valuable feedback. It was so important in our joint aspiration to create something that the science community really feels is useful, and putting a lot of the theory that's out there into practice. And hopefully this will be first in a very long line of new communications initiatives for the IPCC, and it's been a real privilege. But with that, I'll hand over to Adam to introduce the handbook itself, and then I'll stick around for questions afterwards.
Thanks, Roz, and thanks, Leanne, and hello to all of you who've joined us today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share, as Roz and Leanne said, some insights from our handbook, but also I hope to maybe spark some wider conversations about the role of scientists in communicating and engaging on climate change, and about this growing evidence base that we have on how to communicate, how to engage on climate change more effectively. Before I go into the handbook and talk about the 6 principles, which is the framework, the structure of the handbook, I just want to take a step back and take a few moments to reflect on something that I guess most of us we know, we understand, but perhaps don't necessarily appreciate, which is that how much of a unique undertaking the IPCC assessment procedures are. You know, these are things that have been running for 3 decades, that have involved thousands of scientists from dozens of different disciplines reviewing dozens of different topics and themes, and tens of thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles, gradually building up through that process of painstaking consensus-making, confident statements about climate change, everything that we know about climate change. As if that wasn't hard enough, it then gets looked at and signed off on by representatives of many of the world's governments. In short, it is quite an undertaking, and the IPCC has plenty on its plate already, but there has been something missing, or something that's been underutilised, and I think certainly under-invested in, and that is the communication side of things. That's both in terms of including the sort of social science on engagement and communication in the assessment reports themselves, but also how those reports are then communicated to wider audiences beyond specialist circles. Until very recently, a tiny number of people within the IPCC were doing a huge amount of work to try and communicate the outputs of this global organisation. And as we've heard several times already on this call, that truism that climate change doesn't communicate itself is really sat behind this handbook, and it sits behind almost all of our work at Climate Outreach. And I guess in response to that challenge, we know that also stretching several decades now, there's a growing body of knowledge on climate change communication. And you could ask, well, doesn't the IPCC have enough to do? Should it also be engaging with this additional body of literature? And I think you can answer that question in a variety of different ways, but one answer would be that we don't have that many moments in the climate change calendar where the public, the political discourse is elevated, where the world to some extent is watching. It happens around the UN conferences every year to some extent, and it happens around the release of IPCC reports. We, and I mean this kind of collectively, broadly, as a society, can't afford to waste those opportunities. We really need to be applying and coordinating our kind of best practice, the best that we know in terms of communication and engagement. And I guess that's what we've tried to do here with this handbook, is to round up some lessons, to point to areas of the field where there's good, solid, robust agreement. We felt, selective on purpose. This is not everything we've ever thought about in terms of the social science of public engagement on climate change. It's lessons that we think are most applicable for IPCC authors, but absolutely for science communicators and communicators beyond that too. And I guess for some of you, on the call, this might feel like kind of new territory, certainly new territory for the IPCC. But for others of you, I'm sure you'll find much of this material familiar, and that's a good thing, I think, because what we're trying to do is synthesize and round up where there's areas of agreement rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the 6 principles in the handbook before we open up for some questions and discussion. So the first point that we make in the handbook is about being a confident communicator. And what does that mean? That means starting from the right assumptions, because scientists are generally, there are exceptions, but generally, consistently highly trusted. Independent scientists as a profession, where surveys are conducted in countries around the world, are found to be well trusted, right up there with doctors, nurses, other medical professionals. So we're not talking about journalists and politicians here in terms of levels of public trust. Scientists are generally well trusted, and that's a good thing. It provides a really good platform, a good baseline, and the credibility that scientists generally have is partly about their specialist expertise, their ability to be an expert on something and to speak coherently about a subject that's important, that matters. But it's also credibility built on being authentic, speaking in a voice that is your own. And this isn't just a good principle of science communication, it's just a good principle of communication, full stop. So somewhere in that mix of expertise but also having an authentic voice is the credibility that should give scientists the confidence they need to go about their communication in the best possible way. Now, there's no one correct voice for a scientist to take when they're communicating about their research. And that's important to say, I think, because this is an age-old debate that goes back many, many years. What is it appropriate for a scientist to say and do around their research? So for some people, they would consider talking about the implications of their findings as beyond their role. For other people, they would just see that as part of their job. But certainly, as many commentators, including Stephen Schneider, have pointed out, it's perfectly possible to be a credible scientist and to use your own voice to have perspectives and opinions on the implications and consequences of your science. So, specifically in terms of the IPCC, what does that mean? Well, as an organisation, the IPCC is policy neutral, as Roz said, and when IPCC scientists are speaking on behalf of the IPCC, when they're wearing that hat, then IPCC scientists are policy neutral too. But that isn't the only thing that IPCC scientists will be doing in their communication. They're also scientists with wider interests. They are also people who have very, very, very relevant and well-informed opinions. And in that space between their organisational official capacity and their individual role as a citizen does provide the space for people to give their personal views if they wish. If there's a point to summarise what I was just saying, it's that it is crucial and absolutely allowed for scientists to give some of their self in their communication that they do. So as well as conveying the facts and figures of their message in a credible way that relates to their expertise, there is also space to speak as yourself to kind of rehumanise climate change communication. I think is absolutely essential. Okay, the second principle in our handbook is really about getting out of the kind of specialist bubble, which I would very much count myself as being in, and includes scientists, it includes policymakers, it includes campaigners. We all speak to each other using this kind of technocratic language that relates to the big numbers that define the discourse on climate change, or the specialist discourse on climate change. Parts per million, global average temperatures, that kind of thing. But these aren't really the entry points for most people beyond those specialist circles. That doesn't mean that those numbers are not important, that they shouldn't be in the mix somewhere in terms of communication, but it does mean that we can, as communicators, try to build bridges to where people are by focusing on and framing our scientific messages using more tangible, more everyday, kind of real-world examples. So perhaps instead of, or as well as, talking about emissions trajectories, we can frame messages about decarbonisation in terms of the health benefits that decarbonisation brings. Cleaner air, less congestion, that kind of thing. On a related topic in terms of communicating around energy, we've done a fair bit of work at Climate Outreach, looking at how do you connect on energy and climate change across the political spectrum. And we found that when communicating around energy saving, energy efficiency, language around avoiding wastefulness, and that being a kind of sensible, pragmatic, common sense thing to do, is a set of ideas, a set of frames that resonates across the political spectrum. Metaphors, analogies can help too, but again, as with all of the advice here and with all communications guidance, it's good just to try and see, is there an evidence base in the first place, or test them yourselves. So a lot of us use the idea of a blanket, greenhouse gases as a blanket for trapping heat. That's widely used, it's been tested to be effective. Another widely used example is trying to express the probabilistic relationship between weather and weather events, extreme weather events and climate change, using the idea of rolling the dice and the dice being loaded, so climate change loading the dice of extreme weather. Now, that certainly resonates with me, and I'm sure many of us have used that in our communication, but in one UK study, when that was trialled and tested, some people responded in a very different way, and what they heard in that gambling analogy was about scientists fixing the findings of their studies to reflect what they wanted to hear. So it's just about trying to test things or see if there's an evidence base in the first place. The third principle in our handbook is really about finding common ground with your audience. And again, this is a principle of good communication, whatever it may be, climate change, science, or more widely. And it can be as simple as thinking, what is a kind of interest that a local group that you might be going to speak to have? How can you connect with that? Because as we've heard already, unfortunately, just conveying the facts is not enough for effective engagement. So, an accurate scientific message is necessary, but not sufficient for effective engagement. And that's because we know that people's values, people's worldviews, these really basic fundamental things shape how they think about climate change, how they think about a whole range of different subjects, even more than the amount that they know about that subject. So, for example, someone who has the kind of ideological perspective that government shouldn't interfere in markets, they shouldn't interfere in citizens' lives, might not like the sound of a climate policy around, say, subsidising renewable energy that very much sounds like that. They might work backwards from there to not take as seriously the underlying risks of climate science. So that's an example of working backwards from values and worldviews to assessing a body of scientific knowledge. So this can be as simple as doing a bit of background research, the group that you're going to go and speak with, the event that you know you'll be presenting at, who are the audience, what are their interests, can you research something that you think they might be interested in, think about how climate projections might relate to that issue, whether that's food or gardening or travel or something like that. It's just about finding common ground. The fourth principle in the handbook is about telling a human story. So it relates to this idea of being yourself, or scientists being able to speak and talk with a personal voice. So for the IPCC, this means showing the human face behind the IPCC. Who are they? Why do they do the work that they do? What brought them to this in the first place? And it's important to emphasize here this word story is used in different ways in different contexts. So this is not about making up a story, like a fictitious story that we would make up for a fairy tale or for a children's story. This is about story as a narrative framework, as a format for communication. So in the handbook, we refer to a specific example of this, which is developed by Randy Olson, and is a framework for developing scientific messages using a story narrative framework, where you say something about yourself, you talk about a conflict or a challenge that you've overcome, and then how that challenge was resolved at the end of that story. So this is a classic sort of ancient narrative framework, and there's no reason that it shouldn't apply to science as well as other methods of storytelling. The fifth principle in our handbook is really about not getting stuck behind the challenges and the pitfalls of communicating around uncertainty. So clearly uncertainty is something that is not going to go away. It's a feature of climate science as much as it's a feature of any other complex science or body of knowledge. But for people outside of specialist circles, uncertainty often means something quite distinct. It can be equated with ignorance all too easily. So people might move from thinking, okay, scientists don't know everything about this, to thinking, well, they don't know anything. It's a bit of a tricky concept for non-specialist audiences. And that's partly because of the way it's taught in schools, as a set of facts and figures rather than as a method for understanding the world. But it's also partly the way it gets presented in the media. So uncertainty is not going away, but what we can do as science communicators is lead with what we know. And there is a huge amount of agreement on the basics of climate science. So this could mean pointing to the scientific consensus on how human activity is affecting the climate. It could also mean pointing to the social consensus on the same topic. In most countries around the world where this research has taken place, you find that a majority of people agree with the idea that human activity is changing the climate and are concerned about it to at least some extent. So there's a kind of scientific and social element to leading with what we know and where we have common ground. I mean, one kind of textbook example, I guess, of uncertainty communication is around the relationship between extreme weather, storms, floods, and a changing climate. Now, there's different ways you could go about talking about this relationship. You could say, well, we've always had storms, we've always had floods. We can't make a really direct and easy causal link between any one weather event and climate change. Or we could say, well, this storm, this flood, fits exactly the pattern that scientists have been predicting for many years. Scientists are increasingly able to link single weather events and changes in the climate. And people are starting to join the dots too, to see those links between the weather they're experiencing and the climate change that they're told about. So shouldn't we make that link in the hope of protecting other communities from these kinds of impacts in the future? You know, both of those ways of phrasing that relationship are perfectly acceptable, but they're very different ways of telling that story, or of telling a compelling story about the link between weather and climate change. The sixth principle in the handbook, I guess up until now I've been focusing really on how we use language most effectively in our presentations, in our writing, to frame it in the most effective way, to be confident. But telling an effective story, communicating well, is only partly about words. It's also about the visual medium, increasingly so, given the explosion in social media. So it's good to know that there is also an evidence base on visual communication. A couple of examples. Researchers at the Tyndall Centre in the UK have put together some guidance specifically for the IPCC that is around how to use graphs, data visualization effectively, which is one side of visual communication. At Climate Outreach, we have looked through our Climate Visuals project at how people respond to and engage with images of climate change. So we carried out research in 3 countries with over 3,000 people, and we showed them a whole stack of different images, and we developed a framework, a set of principles, much like the principles in this handbook, for how to use images, photographic images of climate change effectively. Just to give a flavour of that, we found that people, although they've certainly recognised and understood polar bears on melting ice, what they tended to gravitate more towards were images that showed more everyday human stories, more authentic people going about their work or being affected by climate change in some way. So the image that's on the front cover of the handbook, which is the one you can see here, is not a random selection. It's designed to fit with the ethos that comes from the Climate Visuals work. And if you're interested in knowing more about that work, then there is an evidence-based library of images at climatevisuals.org to take a look at. Right. With sincere apologies for the technical challenges as part of that presentation, that wraps up what I wanted to say. and I would like to hand over to take some questions, which I think Leanne will be reading out selections of.
Yes, thank you, Adam. So questions are coming in to the question box, and please do send any more questions and comments that you have. The first one I'd like to ask you, Adam, is how do you deal with a mixed language audience, i.e. native and non-native English speakers?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I think this actually is a good question, because I think it gets at something that has been on all of our minds as we've been putting this resource together. As Roz says, I think we've been really, well, firstly very excited by the opportunity to put it together. We've then been really pleased by the response and the reaction that it's had. But I think there is something or some additions that could be made to the handbook in a future version, which would essentially start to set out how does this apply in different countries, in different cultures around the world. Because what we've done is pull together the evidence base such as it is, and this is quite strongly skewed towards the US, the UK, Europe, in terms of where the research on public engagement has been done, certainly in terms of what's been published in English language journals. So that's a kind of unfortunate skew that we have to deal with if we're going to summarise the literature that's there. But it certainly doesn't mean that that's all the knowledge there is. And I think what I would actually really value the opportunity to do, and maybe Roz will say more about this as well, but is actually to put a call out now to all of you, and we've got participants on this call from around the world. Let us know about examples of what you might see to be really good communications practice, or perhaps stuff that hasn't worked quite as well, case studies essentially that can really bring to life some of these principles that are in the handbook and apply them in different cultures, different regions of the world, because I think that would make for a really valuable update to this resource, and it's something that Roz and I have started talking about already.
Thank you. Well, just to absolutely back up, just totally agree 100% with everything that Adam just said there. This is very much the start of an evolving resource, something we'd like to see as an evolving resource. And really, just to say, like, this is the first time that we've done anything like this, that the IPCC has done anything like this. So it really is, the starting point, and there is a lot more that we can do. And it's really great that we're having those conversations now, because we're already thinking of, what V2 is going to be. So perhaps, what one of the primary things to think about is how to capture that a wider international focus, and really, just to, again, echo what Adam said, we'd really like to hear from all of you about how exactly we can do that, and share with us the resources and literature and examples and case studies that you have or know about from around the world, and we can work that into the next product. I mean, we'll have a bit more of a think about how we can kind of formally do this, whether we set up some kind of portal where we can have these conversations and people can post all of these resources somewhere that we and everyone else can see them. But really, we are very much inviting the input from anyone who's taken an interest in this handbook and can see themselves using it as to how we develop it further. So a little bit of crowdsourcing for V2 is certainly on the cards, and something that we really like to do, to think how we can expand and continue to make this the most useful resource that it can be.
Okay, thank you. Lots of questions coming in. Thank you. A few questions about how to put into practice, this handbook. What kind of support could scientists have to start putting into practice some of these principles, and how do you move from reading the handbook to actually starting to implement this in your day-to-day work?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I'll refer back to Roz again for, I guess, that application to how IPCC scientists can put this into place. But in general, I'll answer that in two ways. I think the first thing to say is that as an organisation, we do a lot of, as well as the resources that we produce, we do a lot of training for different groups, different institutions, and different audiences and communities. So that's the kind of obvious next step with a resource like this, is to use it as the basis for some training where you can really work through with a particular group, what does this mean for your challenge specifically? And I think that there's always that next step to take with work like this. It's an interesting balance to strike, I think, with this kind of work, where the onus is on putting together a kind of synthesis of what we know, what we can reliably say is a good or a more improved, enhanced way of going about communication. So they're at that level of principles to look at and then to use when designing or when putting together a specific piece of engagement, because for any specific piece of communication, piece of engagement, there's going to be a whole range of questions that a general document like this can't individually address. But I guess it's about working through using this as a kind of, a checklist, not a rule book, but a checklist to look at and to say, how can I apply this general principle to this specific challenge that I have in front of me, which as we know can mean quite different things depending on what the purpose of your communication is, who your audience is, what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. I'll keep going, Roz, unless you want to add anything. Another question coming from somebody asking, any advice for academics or those working in communications with academics who are less keen on stories and who are maybe less comfortable talking about doing storytelling, but want to do better at engaging the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think none of what's in this resource is mandatory or compulsory. They're things to draw on if you feel comfortable. I guess it goes back to that idea at the beginning of the presentation, at the beginning of the handbook, about feeling confident, and I guess a sort of empowered communicator when engaging with an audience is a good thing. For some people, that might mean really getting to grips with the narrative form, thinking, how can I put myself, my personal circumstances into the public engagement that I do. For other people, it might be more restricted to, using the guidance from the Tyndall Centre to produce graphs that nevertheless resonate a bit more effectively than they might have done without that guidance. Checking in on the climate visuals resource to use that evidence base, thinking about not getting lost in the uncertainty pitfalls. So I think there's a range of advice and guidance in this report, and as I said, there's lots more besides. This isn't the kind of summary of everything anyone's ever done on climate change communication, intentionally. But I think if there's interest in applying the evidence base, the social science of how to do the communication more effectively, there's a range of different ways that can be done. It doesn't have to be about telling a very involved personal story, which I can certainly understand is not something that's an everyday occurrence for most of us. I guess we mostly put our departmental affiliation and who funded the research on the slide rather than anything about our individual lives.
If I can just add very quickly to that as well. I think maybe something that is really deeply embedded in this handbook and something we've been very aware of and very, very mindful of really is that this is a very personal thing. The balance to strike will be different for different people. Situations that different scientists feel comfortable in will vary from one to the next, which isn't to say that comfort zone can't be expanded, but I think it is important to find that comfort zone and to practice. These things, this is difficult. We wouldn't be doing this handbook if this was something that was just straightforward. I think it probably does take a bit of time to pick one of these principles and be very proactive about possibly trying it out, and then we can all sit and talk together and evaluate how that particular principle was put into practice and what the outcome was, and talk to our audiences and find out what works as well. But because Adam mentioned Stephen Schneider earlier, and there's a really nice reference within this handbook to an essay he wrote actually a long time ago now, and it was about, as Adam explained, how to kind of strike that balance between talking effectively to a non-specialist audience whilst retaining your credibility as a scientist, and how tricky that can be to tread that line, and as well as concluding that that was possible and indeed okay to strive to do both of those things. He also made the very sort of careful reflection that is a very personal balance, and it's that's as true today as it was then, and so a lot of this again is about, well, from our perspective, from the IPCC's perspective, this is about signalling to the authors and to the wider scientific community and the outside world that we are very much here to support our authors to do that in a very tailored and specific way. And as I said before, we will be looking at ways to scale up the practical advice that's given in this handbook, putting some of that into practice, and then coming back and evaluating what more we can do. So again, just to kind of re-emphasize that this is really the very, very start of the process. This isn't it. The handbook done, tick box done. This is really the very beginning of a long process that we can work very closely with our scientists together.
A few questions around can we provide examples or links to examples of scientists that use storytelling effectively, that use values-based communication effectively? You mentioned Katharine Hayhoe. Perhaps you could expand a bit on why she's a good communicator about climate change, and any other scientist you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I guess, to stick with Katharine Hayhoe, I think she's, as well as being a specialist and an expert, she's really embraced the idea of connecting with and reaching out to, I guess, what you might term kind of tough or hard to reach audiences. So as well as being a climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe is also a Texan evangelical Christian, and that is an audience of people who it has been difficult to connect with on climate change. That kind of political polarisation that you especially see in the States is very real and has been difficult to overcome. And Katharine Hayhoe's response to that has been not to shy away from it, not to shout at people and say they're wrong, not to try and kind of debunk their faulty ideas and replace them with the truth, but to start the conversation from where people are and to try and find some common ground, to talk about local cultural, social examples that her audience is familiar with, and to build a story about climate change and how society might respond to it from there. In some ways, she's a very particular example, but I think in the work that she does on communication and engagement, it really does bring to life a lot of these principles, I would say. I don't know whether Roz has any other examples of people that take this kind of approach already.
I would have said something very similar to what you just said. So that sums it up for me, and why she's so good at what she does. There's a lot to learn.
Okay, so next question, people asking about how they can, whether you have any tips on communicating with people who are skeptic, and that could include unfriendly media, or just you show up at a group and you're presenting, and what do you do?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words on this, and I think Roz might want to as well. We took a very conscious decision with this handbook not to frame this as how do you kind of overcome a really skeptical, challenging audience, and that's for a couple of reasons, I think. Firstly, because we don't want to perpetuate, the idea that everywhere you go, there's people out to get you, and that scientists are, thought of as the enemies, and that everyone wants to deny climate change. Because with some exceptions in a small number of countries, and even there it's not across the board, climate change skepticism is not particularly common. So it's not the case that you're going to run into audiences like that around the world. Outside of the English-speaking world, it's really not very common at all. That's one point to make. I think it is important to bear that in mind. Secondly, I guess it does depend how you think about what climate change skepticism is. I mentioned some of this earlier in the presentation. What defines people's views about climate change is only partly the level of knowledge they have about it. There's been a couple of studies that have suggested that, in fact, people who are skeptical about climate change but are the most scientifically literate are kind of even more skeptical than people who are less scientifically literate. That might seem a bit counterintuitive, but if you don't think about skepticism as being like a deficit, an absence of knowledge, and instead you think about it as people feeling kind of under threat and attacked by what they see as the implications of dealing with climate change, then it makes a lot more sense. The question is then, what do you do about that? Well, this is where the finding common ground thing comes in. We need to find, and I'm talking very broadly now, not as the IPCC, but collectively, we need to find ways of making climate change make sense, using frames and language and narratives that connect with a whole diversity of different public values, because this can't be something that lives only on one side of the political spectrum. So to me, and I think this, sits underneath a lot of our work at Climate Outreach, the challenge of dealing with skepticism is in trying to find some common shared values and building a compelling story about climate change and how to respond to it from those values. It's not about knocking down people's arguments and setting them right, because they're not ready to hear it, essentially, at that point. You need to kind of develop a shared sense of a shared starting point where you can work forwards through then the science and what it shows. But without that shared platform, those ideological values-based worldview filters kick in, and they're pretty effective at knocking out even the best, most evidenced argument if that common ground's not there.
It's a good question, because I do think we do have to be very realistic about this. I mean, we're not kind of naively expecting to sort of talk into a vacuum. There can be a very difficult communications environment, for sure. That there's no doubt about that. There are, there is a lot of misinformation around. There are various media outlets and politicians who lap that up as well. But as Adam said, climate skepticism is persistent, but it's largely a problem in the Anglosphere as well. I think we do have to take a wider view and see that it's not so much of an issue in other parts of the world. But yeah, I am speaking personally here as well, that misinformation needs highlighting whenever we see it, for sure. And that's everybody's responsibility. So yes, climate scientists should be a part of that. IPCC scientists can easily be a part of that. And that's something I've always thought. And I do think climate scientists also, as well as the principles of good communication, I think we do need to be wise to the ways, just the way that the media works, what people hear when climate scientists speak, sometimes understanding what your audience hears, as well as some of the common kind of myths and misconceptions that are around. And I've kind of built a career around that, so I do think that's an important issue to be mindful of. But again, those are separate things. This handbook is not meant to cover everything, as Adam said. Part of communicating, part of a good public understanding and conversation and discussion about the science is communicating it clearly in the first place, and that's really what this is about. And that's not just about telling; it's about listening as well, and that two-way process. So I think whilst we should take kind of misinformation and difficult communications environments like that very seriously, and do work there as well. This handbook is really about, there's a kind of message of sort of empowerment about this. Don't be disheartened when you see things like that. Be motivated, be emboldened by that kind of thing. There's lots that the climate science community can be doing right now, and we're very supportive of that, and hopefully pursuing that in an active way as well. So it's a positive message, as Adam said. This handbook, we really wanted it to be something that that kind of emboldens climate scientists to get out and be part of these conversations. Otherwise, they'll just happen without you, and nobody wants that. So yeah, there's lots that we can do.
Thank you, Roz. Question for you. People wondering how these new insights are going to percolate in the IPCC Working Group 1 team and beyond.
Sorry, how it will percolate through the IPCC and beyond?
So I guess how is this new handbook going to? How do you envision that this new handbook will change the way that IPCC scientists communicate their work?
Yeah, I mean, well, so firstly, the handbook is being produced now at quite a critical time. As I said earlier, there's an awful lot of events and reports that we've got coming up this year that all three working groups and the Secretariat are all working in jointly together. So, this resource came from this TSU. We commissioned this product, but we've all worked very closely on it, and it's something that all the other working groups are fully supportive of, and it's going to be something that all IPCC scientists, including the ones who just who will be part of the next assessment report as well. That process is just beginning now. So it's a resource that all of our scientists and researchers will have access to from now forward. And again, if they feel like they want to put some of this into practice, or already do, but kind of want to refine their skills and find more opportunities to put into practice, then they now know, or if they didn't before, they now know that they, just approach us, and we'll definitely find ways to scale that up. So, I mean, I think it's worth probably speaking a little bit just about the IPCC's communication strategy broadly, because this does fit right into that. And as I said, this is a really kind of exciting time. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of focus happening now. And yeah, the IPCC Secretariat team, as Adam said earlier as well, they do a stellar job of an enormous amount of work, and there's just so much for a relatively small team of people. So it's really fantastic that we have this new communications capacity within each of the working groups to complement what's already been going on, because we really want to make sure that the information that the work the IPCC is doing really reaches the audiences who need it. Our primary audience is the original intention. The primary audience are policymakers, but the word policymakers actually covers decision makers at all levels. So that's a huge range of people just right there. And we're very cognizant that IPCC science is used by a whole host of other people and sectors. Media, health, industry, civil society, business, finance, education, the list goes on. So there's no reason that we can't take these principles and apply those in our communications with all these different sectors. There's various things that we're working on, as well as this public engagement side of things. So the summary for policymakers is a part of all IPCC reports that it's the part that people tend to see, tend to hear about. It's the most read. It's kind of a distillation of the most policy relevant parts of each report. But there has been very fair criticism that sometimes those are not the easiest to read. We are mindful of that, and we are working on that. And also other materials that go alongside in the report, such as the frequently asked questions. These are a fantastic resource that were very, very popular last time round. So they kind of provide a very plain language, accessible summary of some of the main topics and questions that the report covers. So we're developing those along with fact sheets and explainers, and also the graphics within the report themselves. We've putting a lot more resources towards working with graphic designers, information designers, cognitive scientists to develop graphics that really are as effective as they can be. Thinking about what it is that they're trying to convey. Because the old the graphics should work. They should be able to they should say kind of 1,000 words rather than take 1,000 words to explain, I guess, is something that we're working hard to do the best we can with. I think, there's a lot that kind of sits alongside the public engagement work that we're doing here, and I think again it's worth just making the point that this is the beginning of the process for our authors. We are running a new communications seminar or webinar series for authors where we're going to continue some of this training and provide that opportunity for authors to come in and talk to us about what kind of training, what kind of support they're looking for. So it's certainly something that we're going to put into practice now and scale up throughout the 3 working groups, the secretariat, all the events and public outreach events that we've got planned, the conferences we've got planned, the special reports we've got planned, the next assessment report, and we'll be learning from all of these experiences as we go, so we can constantly refine. Again, we're working with the best available evidence, and we're gonna keep refining the support and the products that we produce to make sure that we do continue doing that. But again, we value feedback from IPCC authors and the wider scientific community about what kind of things, what kind of resources, what kind of tools would be useful, and how you envisage yourselves using the ones that we are producing. So it's very much a two-way process that we're starting here, and we really want to serve our authors as best as we can. So we do encourage everyone to just get in touch. We're very we really invite feedback on everything that we're doing, and that's how we're going to make sure that we continue to do the best that we can and produce resources that really are valuable for our authors.
Thank you very much, Roz and Adam. It's now 4 p.m. I'm here in the UK anyway, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. But we welcome, get in touch if you'd like to discuss this further with us. And, we designed the handbook to be useful to you, and we look forward to hearing how you might be using it, the feedback that you have about it. And we invite you to connect with us if you'd like to collaborate. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending a recording to everybody who's registered, so you'll, with the full set of slides, and apologies again for the technical issue at the beginning. So Adam, I don't know if you want to any final thoughts from you?
Well, just to thank everyone for joining us today, and thanks for the questions. Thank you to Roz and the technical support unit of Working Group 1 for the opportunity to put this together. And I think it's just, as well as the value for the IPCC, this sends a really positive and powerful signal to the wider climate change community that the science of climate change communication is something that should be part of the IPCC's remit, and therefore should be part of all of our remits as we move forward on climate change.
Yeah, and just for me to thank everyone, huge thanks to the support that's been shown for this handbook. It's really fantastic to see the response. We've really enjoyed producing it, and it's been a great experience and very privileged to work with Climate Outreach in producing it as well. And thank you to all the people who've helped us with valuable feedback along the way, and to get the handbook how it is. But again, do get in touch with your suggestions for V2.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.